welcome all to the next installment of our ad hoc seminar series on electricity markets. We have a speaker from Spain today, so even though I'm going to speak as if this were the evening, it is the morning for our speaker. I'd like first to acknowledge country. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging a traditional custodian of the land on which we stand, wherever we may be in Australia at the moment, and pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and extend a warm welcome to any of them who may be in attendance tonight. So my name is Guillaume Roger. In case you haven't met me yet, I'm an associate professor of economics at Monash, and our speaker today is Natalia Fabra from Carlos III in Madrid. Some of you may know Natalia or know of her work. Natalia has been working on the IO and the market design of electricity market for some time now. She was named, I think, the best young Spanish economist. Is it Spanish or European? Correct me if I'm wrong, Natalia. Some years ago. Spanish only, small scale only Spanish. Okay. And we're very pleased to have her today. She's going to address us on one aspect of the economics of storage, whereby she's going to make the case that market structure matters. So over to you, Natalia. Thanks very much for joining us at this early hour of the morning in Spain, and the floor is all yours. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Guillaume. Thank you so much for all of you for being here and for the invitation. I wish I could be there, but in any case, it's great to be able to share this with you. As Guillaume has said, I've been working on electricity markets for quite a while now. And more recently, I've been interested in storage for obvious reasons. For all of those of you who are familiar with electricity markets, if we want to increase the deployment of renewables being intermittent, we need some buffer that can provide some backup in order to compensate for fluctuations in renewable supply. And clearly there's many ways we can address this, either through investing in gas capacity, either through demand response, or I would rather say, and investing in storage. So what I'm going to be talking about today is storage. How should storage be managed? Are markets providing the right incentives to invest in storage? If not, what should we do about this? So let me start with some simple evidence. This evidence is coming from Spain, but I guess this is a common feature of many electricity markets nowadays and electricity markets in the future. What this figure is showing, it's showing some evidence. This is 2019 data in the Spanish electricity market, because clearly 2020 has been a very weird year in which electricity demand has been heavily affected by COVID. So the yellow line represents the average hourly electricity demand pattern in Spain. And the various blue lines, those represents the generation of solar assets in Spain. The lower contour, the lower line, represents current production average on a yearly basis, on an hourly basis, solar production. But the plan is that we are going to scale up our investments in solar investments during the current decade. So the various lines that you see going up and getting closer to demand, those represents the expected production of solar generation over these years as we increase solar investments during the current decade. So what does this imply? If we net out the solar production from the demand function, we are very soon gonna get this well-known dark curve, by which the concentration of solar generation during the mid hours of the day will imply that demand patterns or net demand patterns will be heavily affected by these investments, being really much lower and even getting to some negative numbers in some cases during the mid hours of the day, whereas clearly at night when the sun doesn't shine, we are going to still have the same type or similar type of demand. It is in this context that storage becomes particularly valuable in order to flatten the production to meet these changing and more volatile or changing net demand patterns. And this is why energy storage is called to play a key role in the energy transition. First, as I said at the very beginning, it facilitates integration of renewables in the power sector. At times when there's going to be a really abundant renewable electricity, there might be some spills, and therefore storage might allow us to make use of those spills in order to substitute production at other times when the sun doesn't shine or when the wind doesn't blow. Storage is also going to help us improve security of supply because we'll be able to meet those peaks of demand with the energy that we have stored instead of having to invest in backup capacity and therefore reducing the overall investment cost in generation capacity. And at the same time, storage, if properly operated, would allow us to reduce generation costs because it would allow us to store electricity at times when it is cheap to produce and use it instead to replace expensive energy at times of peak demand. The question is whether these benefits that I have summarized in these 3 blocks are internalized by market players. That is, whether these benefits are exclusively private or whether there are some social benefits associated with these 3 key ideas. And the related question is whether complementing market mechanisms, whether we need to rely on other alternative complementary instruments to induce the efficient operation of storage as well as the efficient amount of investment. So let me try to address the question first. Do markets internalize these benefits? The first benefit that I mentioned was about renewables integration. Do markets really internalize this? Well, my point of view is that only if this storage is owned by renewables, so that we have these hybrid solutions by which in the renewables side, we complement that with a storage facility so that if inside there's some spills, the renewables owners would be able to store those spills and make use of them later on. But these more external and social benefit of, if we have a storage, we can really proceed along the energy transition and increase the ambition in deploying renewables. This part of the social benefit is probably not internalized by markets. What about security of supply? Well, we know that security of supply is by its very nature a positive externality. That is, if I invest in storage, I'm reducing the probability of blackouts. The blackout would have, as we have seen in various examples, or not necessarily the blackout, but problems with security of supply, as we have seen in Texas very recently, but not only. This has a very large social and economic cost that would be avoided if some investor invest in capacity, or in this case, storage capacity, so that incidence or the risk of security of supply problem is being reduced. This is not being internalized by market forces unless we do something about it and introduce further mechanisms. The third question, which is really the one that I'm going to be focusing on during this talk, refers to whether storage owners internalize the benefits that they create by reducing generation cost. And the answer to this question is that they will internalize that only if markets are perfectly competitive, both in the storage segment as well as in the generation segment. If we have market power in generation and or market power in storage, and if we have vertical integration between generation and storage, some of these positive benefits that come through the reduction in generation cost will not be fully internalized by market players. The first and the second point, storage owners do not necessarily internalize the social benefits regarding the deployment of renewables and improving security of supply, implies that markets alone would tend to lead to underinvestment in storage. Whereas the third point concerns over market power, particularly so in the storage segment, would also tend to strengthen underinvestment, implying that some sort of regulation is going to be needed. So this third issue is the idea that I'm going to be focusing on during most of the talk. So I'll try to provide all the reasons and arguments of why this is the case. The work that I'm going to be presenting is part of the paper that I've been working on with David Andres Terozzo, who is a PhD student at the European University Institute in Florence. In this paper, as I said before, we leave aside point 1 and point 2, that is all the market failures that could be related to storage, in order to focus on market power. So we want to understand how does market power affect the storage decisions. And when I refer to storage decisions, I refer both to the decisions to invest in storage, as well as once that storage capacity is in place, the incentives to properly operate those storage facilities. And I want to understand how these incentives, or how the efficiency of these storage decisions is affected by the market structure that has an impact on market power. In particularly, I'll be comparing what happens in a market in which storage is perfectly competitive versus one in which storage operators act strategically, being aware of the price impacts of their storage decisions. I'll also be looking at the comparison between a generation segment that is perfectly competitive versus one in which there's imperfect competition in the generation market. And I'll also be focusing on the impacts of vertical integration between generation and storage, and how that affects the efficiency of storage decisions. Clearly, when we talk about storage, we are talking about many different things. And what I claim is that depending on the type of storage technology that we are dealing with, this will have certain implications on the market structure, and therefore on the scope for, or the potential for market power in those segments. Just as a very brief overview of what I have in mind, for instance, compare the differences between storage coming from electric vehicles. Clearly, we can take all these electric vehicle drivers as price takers. When they decide to store electricity in their EV batteries, they take prices as given. So we're talking about this type of storage. It's probably better to think of storage as being perfectly competitive versus one type of storage facility, which we can refer to as probably grid scale batteries, very large batteries. And I understand that some of these large batteries are coming online in Australia. In this case, if these batteries are very large in relation to the whole market, these owners of these batteries might be aware that their investment decisions might have an impact on the electricity market price. And therefore, these owners are better thought as not being price takers anymore, but rather as taking into account the price impacts of their decisions on market prices, which might have important implications on how they decide to operate those batteries. And last, one example of vertical integration, at least in Spain, we have quite a lot of pump hydro storage. For those of you who are not familiar with these are hydro plants that have the ability to pump up the water for which they consume electricity. That is, they would be storing the electricity in the form of water, and then they can use that stored water in order to generate electricity. These facilities are typically owned by the electricity generators. So this is a case of vertical integration between storage and generation. There's quite a hot debate around this issue, in particular regarding the rules for ownership, and there's quite a few different solutions that have been given to these issues. So, for instance, in California, utilities are mandated to invest in storage capacity. So vertical integration somehow comes by law, whereas on the other side of the spectrum, we have Texas, in which utilities are not permitted to own storage capacity. And in different jurisdictions, there's different views regarding whether system operators should be allowed or not allowed to own part of the storage facilities. In Europe, the unbundling restrictions imply that typically system operators are not allowed to own storage facilities unless they somehow justify the fact that some of these storage facilities are needed to properly operate the system. This is just to say, as you know, this is quite a hot topic, and we hope that at least with our work, we'll be able to provide the main ingredients or the key elements for the debate and the forces that affect the incentives to operate and invest in storage facilities, depending on this ownership structure. So let me give you a roadmap of what we do in the paper. I won't be covering the analysis in full detail. The paper is available, and I invite all of you who are interested to look into the paper. My purpose in this presentation is simply to provide the main intuition underlying the main results in the paper. But let me nonetheless give you a summary, an overview of the main type of analysis that we do in the paper. This is mainly a theory paper. So we built a stylized model of competition in wholesale electricity markets, to which we add a storage. So in this market, we assume that demand moves deterministically over time. Clearly, in reality, there are some stochastic components, but we abstract from those for simplicity, and we believe that the addition of these uncertainty in demand would not change or critically change the main results of the paper. We assume that marginal cost of generation are increasing. That is, as we have to meet increasing demand, we have to make use of more expensive technologies, which imply increasing marginal cost. We consider a game which is made of two stages, two steps. First, investment in storage takes place. This is a long-run decision. So once we take this investment decision in storage, that storage capacity is fixed. And once we have that storage capacity in place, then we have a spot market competition given those capacities. Regarding the market structure in generation, we assume that there is some degree of market power that is proxied by the size of a dominant firm. So in essence, we have a group, a fringe of competitive firms that are going to offer all their production into the electricity market at marginal cost. And then we have a dominant player that can be as small or large as we parameterize it in the model, that is rather going to be offering its output in the electricity market in order to maximize its profits, taking into account that its generation decisions are going to affect the market price. Because our focus is on the market structure in storage, we consider various cases. We start with the first best and the second best. We define the first best as a situation in which we have a planner that is deciding on all the relevant aspects of the market. In particular, the regulator decides on how much to invest in storage, how to operate those storage facilities, and also how to efficiently operate the generation assets. So this would be first best world in which costs are minimized or welfare is maximized. Second, we come to a second best world in which still we have this regulator that is operating the storage facilities and deciding how much to invest in storage, but generation is decided or it is determined through market forces. So the regulator doesn't have a say on how these generation facilities are being operated or what the spot electricity market prices are. These two cases will be used as a benchmark to assess what happens when we fully rely on markets. The first case that we are going to consider is the case in which we might have market power in generation, but the storage is perfectly competitive. So we want to understand how this competitive storage owners operate and invest in storage. Next, we are going to consider the case in which we have this very large storage owner that is no longer a price taker, and we want to understand how market power in storage affects storage decisions. And last, we consider the case in which there's vertical integration between storage and generation. The paper also includes some simulations that rely on data coming from the Spanish electricity market. I want to believe that this is representative of many other markets. And with these simulations, we simply want to illustrate some of the workings in the model and what the implications of these different forces can have on market performance. So let me start with some of the main intuitions, some of the main insights that come from the theoretical model. Let us first consider the first best. So the first best, as I said, is a situation in which the regulator decides on everything, essentially. She decides on storage investment, how to operate those storage facilities, and how to schedule generation plans. So the solution is essentially as follows. So if you look at this figure, is this similar dark curve as the one I showed before. This one is instead coming from California. So the green line represents electricity demand during the day, whereas the purple line represents net demand once we have subtracted renewables supply. So we see we also have this off peak in the middle of the day, and these peaks at the beginning of the day and at sunset. So the optimal operation of a given storage capacity by this first best regulator would clearly be to store electricity at times when demand is low and therefore the marginal cost of production are low, fill up all the batteries and use whatever has been stored to release it to replace generation whenever demand peaks, because it is at those moments when the marginal cost of electricity and generation are higher. Because marginal costs are increasing, then it is optimal to flatten demand and to flatten production so as to overall flatten the maximum possible the remaining production patterns during the day. So it's clear how to optimally operate storage. How much should we invest? Well, the value of a storage, if we invest in an additional unit of a storage, in reality, this will allow us to save additional marginal cost. Why? Because if we have an additional unit of storage capacity, we'll be able to store an additional unit of generation at this time to replace one unit of generation at peak time. And this will allow us to save the difference in the marginal cost between these two moments of time. Because a storage capacity is costly, then the optimal solution is to invest in a storage capacity up to the point at which the per unit investment cost is equal to the marginal cost savings associated with this additional unit of storage capacity. Keep in mind that one direct implication of this is that it's never optimal to invest in storage so much so as to fully flatten demand, because if we fully flatten demand so that these red lines would coincide, then the marginal value of a storage capacity, that is those marginal cost savings, will converge to zero, because we'll be storing electricity at a moment of time in which the marginal cost of generation is very similar to the marginal cost that we replace when we release that electricity. So having a storage doesn't mean, if we take optimal decisions, that we will be fully flattening demand over time. So what happens instead under the second best? So remember that under second best, the regulator is deciding on a storage, but generation is totally market driven. So the solution is, in some respects, very similar to what we had before. In particular, the regulator is going to operate the storage facilities so as to flatten demand and production, and it's going to invest in storage up to the point at which the marginal cost savings are equal to 1 unit of storage. So where is the difference? Well, there's a very important difference, which is the fact that if there's market power in the generation market, some of the production decisions are going to be distorted, particularly so at high demand periods when the dominant producer has more incentives to exercise market power. The dominant producer exercises market power by withholding some of the output. Therefore, the fringe is going to inefficiently increase its output. This is going to imply that marginal costs at peak time are going to be higher than in the absence of market power, and therefore the marginal cost savings associated with the storage are greater, because I'll be substituting output storing at times when marginal costs are low and market power is weak, and therefore the marginal cost distortion is smaller. And I'm going to be replacing output at times when that distortion in marginal cost would be greater, and therefore the marginal cost difference is also larger. Another way to say this is that in the presence of market power in the generation market, storage is more valuable than otherwise, because it helps mitigate market power, and mitigating market power comes with the benefit of mitigating these marginal cost distortions. So in a market in which there is market power in generation, under the scenario in which it is the regulator, the one deciding on how much to invest in storage, it is optimal to invest more in storage than under the second best, but still it is the case that demand is not fully flattened. So having characterized what the optimal decisions are in this first best and second best world, let me discuss what happens if we rely all the decisions, both the storage and the generation decisions, to markets, right? And let's first think of the case in which we have a storage, but a storage is perfectly competitive. Whereas in the previous cases, the regulator decides on storage in order to minimize generation cost. Clearly, this is not going to be the case for the storage owners. What they want is to maximize their profits. How do they make profits? They make profits by arbitraging price differences across time. So if this is an example of prices during the day, prices being lower in these mid hours of the day, which is when the solar generation is greater, then they will try to buy at these very low prices to store that electricity and sell that electricity at those times when demand is higher and therefore prices are higher. If the generation market is perfectly competitive, these prices will reflect marginal cost. And therefore, if that is the case, then when storage firms operate in this way, they're truly replicating the first best and even the second best, because they are buying when marginal costs are low and selling with marginal costs are high. However, what about if there's market power in the generation market? Well, market power, as I said before, typically is stronger at times when demand is higher, and therefore the markups, that is the difference between price and marginal cost, they tend to be larger at times of high demand. So what I did is very schematic manner. I overlap the previous price figure with these red lines that somehow represent what would prices look like if there was market power in the generation market. Then we would see that prices would depart from marginal cost much more at times of peak demand. And what this would do is this would artificially increase arbitrage profits, because now the price difference between peak demand and off-peak demand would be enhanced by the exercise of market power. So this can result in overinvestment in storage that somehow is also inefficient. What about instead if we have market power in storage? So now it's no longer right to think of these large storage firms as being price takers, as in the previous case. I gave the example of the EB owners taking prices given. If we have a very large storage operator that is deciding on most of the storage in the electricity system, it's no longer right to think about this firm as being a price taker. Why? Because this firm understands that whatever it does, whether it buys a lot or whether it sells a lot, is going to affect the electricity market prices. In particular, if I concentrate, as in the case of the first best and the second best, all my most of my storage at the same hour of the day, this is going to make these transactions, whenever I buy electricity in this market to store it, this is going to make it more expensive. So in order to avoid that price impact, what I do is that I smooth my storage decisions so as to avoid these very strong price impacts precisely when I'm buying, and therefore when I'm suffering from these price increases. And the same applies symmetrically whenever I'm selling, whenever I'm releasing the amount that I previously stored. I don't want to concentrate all my sales at a given hour of time. That was the case when the regulator was flattening the peaks of demand. Why? Because if I concentrate all my sales in a given hour, that's going to have a strong price depressing effect, and therefore what I sell, I'm going to sell it cheaper. To avoid that, what I do again is to smooth my storage decisions. This is smoothing of these storage decisions, both when I store as well as when I release, is inefficient. Why? Because it would be more efficient for the system in terms of marginal cost savings to store this unit of electricity at this time, or when the marginal cost is lower than here. And at the same time, it would be more valuable that these stored electricity would be used to release and replace electricity at this time, rather than at this time when the marginal costs are lower. The fact that storage decisions are being distorted implies that storage is not as valuable for the system and not as valuable in terms of profits for the storage owner. And this tends to lead to underinvestment. So in the previous case, what we saw was that if storage is perfectly competitive and the market is perfectly competitive, the storage decisions are optimal. However, market power in generation creates overinvestment. What we have seen now is that market power in storage tends to create underinvestment. Let me try to argue what would happen in the case of vertical integration between generation and storage. Again, if we have this large storage facility that is operated by this vertically integrated firm, we should no longer think about this storage operator being a price taker. Why? Because whatever it does on the storage side, whatever it does on the generation side, that is going to affect market prices, and it's going to affect both the profits of the storage facilities as well as generation profits. So now, taking this into account, the vertically integrated firm smooths out the use of storage even more, because not only it wants to avoid the price effects on its storage profits, but also on its generation profit. So everything is smoothed out even more to avoid the price effects, implying that this distortion in the use of storage is also going to reduce the value of storage for the vertically integrated firm, and therefore weakening the incentives to invest in storage. If we put together all these results in order to rank both efficiency as well as consumer surplus under these various structures, we find the following. Market power is creating productive inefficiencies. If we are talking about market power in generation, what we find is that this distorts efficient market shares, as the dominant producer is withholding some output that would rather be efficiently produced. Market power in storage, to the contrary, implies that whatever capacity I have in the market, I'm gonna try to use it less, or I'm gonna try to smooth it out in order to avoid the price effect. So production is not being flattened. This is worsened by vertical integration, and it's worsened when investment decisions in storage are decided by firms and not by regulators, as a wrap-up of the main impacts that we have seen. So if we put all these results together and we look at overall costs, taking into account both cost in generation production as well as cost in investment into storage, clearly we find that efficiency, that is cost, are minimized under the first best. Under the second best, we have a slightly higher cost because of the inefficiencies created by market power in generation, and so on and so forth. That is, as we add layers of market power, that is, if we move from a situation of competitive storage firms to one in which we have a large storage monopoly to one in which we have a vertically integrated dominant firm, as we add these layers of market power, we are getting less and less efficient. That is, costs are going up. Even so, all those cases, even if distorted with respect to the first best, are better than a situation in which we have no storage. If we have no storage, that is the extreme case in which there's no investment in storage, and therefore there's not even the possibility to smooth out the use of storage because we are not using it because we don't have it. So it's better to have a storage, even if we have market imperfections, than not to have a storage at all. But if we decide to have a storage, it's better to have more competitive markets, because the more competitive we are in the various segments, both the storage as well as generation, the closer we will get to the first best. What about consumers? Well, the price ranking is a mirror image of what we saw before regarding efficiency. Consumers will be better off with a storage than without storage. That's fairly clear. But it's also equally clear that the more market power there is in the various segments, both the storage as well as generation, the worse it's going to be for them. So we are in a situation in which there's no trade-off between efficiency and consumer surplus, and both criteria would lead to similar conclusions regarding the impacts of the welfare and consumer surplus impacts of market power in storage and generation. So to illustrate some of these issues, we perform some simulations of the Spanish electricity market. We performed the simulations with 2017 data, when the penetration of renewables was not still that large, and simulations using projections for 2030, when we expect that a large amount of our electricity generation, at least 70%, will come from renewables, because one of the issues that clearly comes out very clearly out of the analysis is the complementarity between renewables and storage. Storage becomes more valuable the more renewables that there are, because renewables enlarge price differences during the day, and at the same time renewables become more valuable if there's a storage, because some of these spills, that is electricity that would not be used, can instead be used as a storage. So in these simulations, we use very detailed data. These simulations are conducted at the hourly level for a whole year to capture all the seasonality. So we use hourly electricity demand patterns, and we also have quite detailed data on generation cost at the plant levels. And what we do is we simulate the market under different investment levels in the storage capacity to try to understand the impacts of storage capacity and the incentives to invest in storage capacity. The main results that we get are in line with the theoretical analysis. As I said, we find a very strong complementarity between renewables and storage. And at least at the current investment cost, at the current storage cost, we find that in the context of the Spanish electricity market, storage is unprofitable at current investment cost if they are only going to be paid according to electricity market prices. And this is the figure that probably most clearly illustrates this third point. Let me try to explain what this represents. What we do in this analysis, on the x-axis, we have various levels of storage capacity. And for each of these levels of storage capacity, we compute for the storage owners, or for the system as a whole, the marginal value of this extra additional unit of storage capacity, which in essence, for instance, if we're in the scenario with competitive storage owners, is given by these arbitrage or price differences between peak prices and off-peak prices. That is, if a storage owner invested in an additional unit of storage capacity, in this case, when there's still a small storage capacity, then the average arbitrage profits that this producer would be able to make per unit of electricity stored and produced would be roughly around 32 euro per megawatt hour. Instead, as we move to the right, as we increase storage capacity, clearly the peak and the off-peak prices start getting closer to each other, precisely because the storage operators are moving production from peak to off-peak demand, and therefore those arbitrage differences become smaller and smaller, and therefore the marginal value of an additional unit of storage capacity is diminishing. There's this decrease in marginal value of storage. Because in this market, in the Spanish electricity market by 2030, we don't expect there to be much market power. We see that the marginal value of storage is very similar if we just focus on marginal cost differences, or if we focus on price differences. At low levels of storage, there's still some market power, and this is why the competitive storage owners internalize higher marginal value of storage, because of the reason I mentioned before. If there's market power, this tends to enlarge the price differences between peak and off-peak, and therefore the competitive storage owners internalize a greater marginal value of storage than the regulators. But as we increase investment in storage, market power is being mitigated, and therefore the three lines converge together. But in any case, they're all diminishing. If we look at these numbers ranging from, say, 15 euro per megawatt hour to 30 or 30-ish euro per megawatt hour, are well below the current investment cost in storage capacity that are well above 100. That is, if we only paid storage owners according to their arbitrage profits in the electricity market, they would not find it profitable to invest, because their values that they make out of this investment in storage are well below their current cost. So if we think that the additional social benefits that I mentioned at the very beginning, point number one, facilitating the integration of renewables, and point number two, increasing security of supply, if those social benefits are large enough, then if we want the storage to take place, we might have to introduce additional instruments so that these storage owners internalize those social benefits beyond the private benefits that they get out of operating their storage facilities in the electricity market, because by doing so, their private benefits are below the social benefits. In the paper, in the simulations, we also consider the impacts of storage capacity on many other dimensions, including total cost. So the more we invest in storage, the lower generation costs are going to be, because of this effect of replacing expensive generation with cheap generation, and the impact on how much consumers will end up paying. It's a bit ambiguous. In this case, we find that it's slightly decreasing, but we understand that in other cases these comparative statics might be the contrary. So if I may, Guillaume, let me just conclude so that we can have some time for questions and discussions. I would just like to highlight that we strongly believe, and this is one of the conclusions of our analysis, that the storage brings many benefits to electricity market, but the scale of these benefits, which are going to be positive no matter what, but the scale of these benefits will critically depend on the market structure. Market power, whether on generation or on storage, is going to distort the optimal use of storage facilities, and it's also going to distort investment in storage. So we find that market power in generation tends to lead to overinvestment. However, market power in storage tends to lead to underinvestment. And what we find is that vertical integration between storage and generation, by combining these two effects, is going to give the most inefficient outcome. We believe that if we want to promote storage, arbitrage profits coming from market revenues are not enough. And we believe that we should introduce some additional arrangements so as to promote investment in storage. One of them could be a storage capacity auctions, just as we do with renewables. We could do something similar with clearly some differences for storage, keeping in mind, however, that even if through storage capacity auctions, we might be able to induce the right amount of investment in storage, there's the potential issue still remaining regarding the inefficient use of those storage facilities, if those storage facilities, or if the use of those storage facilities is affected by potential market power distortions. So let me finish here, and I'll be very glad to answer questions or discuss these issues with you.
Well, thank you very much, Natalia. This was an excellent overview of the paper. There are a couple of questions in the chat box. I'm going to relay them to you and to the audience. So one was an interesting question to the problem of narrowing spreads between peak and off-peak prices. So Ben Skinner was saying this is an observation that applies to pretty much every market and every product, in that the entrants, once they enter, tend to necessarily behave in a way which is going to reduce those spreads. So do you have a view on how one can overcome that, for example?
I'm sorry, Guillaume, could you repeat that again? I'm not sure I fully got the question.
Sure. So this was about narrowing spreads.
Yeah.
Between peak and off-peak prices.
Yeah.
And so Ben Skinner was remarking that this is something that we see in many markets. This is not unique to storage. So as soon as you enter, you behave more competitively, and so therefore those spreads tend to narrow. And so I guess the question that follows is, are there any mechanisms to overcome that? Can we think of something like nonlinear prices or capacity payments or any other mechanisms to encourage entry and avoid this problem of narrowing spreads, which are going to essentially deter entry?
Yeah, it's clear that the business model of storage is making profit out of these price differences. So if these price differences disappear, there's no way to make profits, and therefore there's no incentives to enter. But I would say that the price differences is the means by which we incentivize investment, but it's not the final goal. So the final goal is not to have large price differences during the day. If there's no large price differences during the day, probably that implies that the storage is not valuable. So for instance, in the current situation in which in many countries there's still not enough renewables, and most of the time electricity prices are being set by CCGTs, that implies that price patterns are very flat during the day. And I understand that is a big obstacle to have a storage. If we believe there has to be a storage for other reasons, not to substitute one type of generation with another, because CCGTs are the marginal technology all the time. But if we think that we should have a storage because of security of supply reasons, let's say, for instance, or because we want to promote the technology, or you name it, clearly we cannot rely on market profits alone to promote investment, because those market prices without volatility, they are not going to promote those investments, as was implicit in this question. So this is why I was stressing the fact that maybe we should rely on alternative regulatory and market-based mechanisms, such as auctions for storage.
Okay, so thank you very much for that. Let me scroll down the list. So Ben is correcting me, so maybe I misconstrued the question. The question was, why should we intervene in this market when we don't for all the other markets that have the same phenomenon? Okay, I understand that. So, why is it that we should seek alternative mechanisms to this linear pricing problem, such as the narrowing of spread, when we don't do it in other markets?
Well, I would say that we intervene in many markets, including the electricity market. So I'm not very familiar with all the type of regulatory instruments that you use in Australia, but as you know, renewable auctions are becoming very popular and widely spread in most electricity markets around the world. And that's an intervention, right? Because the regulator is deciding on how much renewable investment we want to have, rather than letting it to the market agents to decide how much they want to invest in renewables. And why they do so? Well, they do so for many reasons, among them because of the positive externalities that renewables create on many fronts. The most important one being the environmental, or the fight against climate change. So we do intervene in other markets, and we do intervene precisely when the market fails. And I think that storage is one situation, or is one example that shows that in these cases the market fails. Why? Because generators or storage owners do not internalize those social benefits that they create when they invest in storage, by improving security of supply, by facilitating the deployment of renewables, and by allowing for this overall reduction in generation costs. So it's precisely those social benefits that are not internalized through market forces that justify, we call it intervention, but I think intervention has somehow a negative implicit meaning in the word. So rather than intervention, we could simply say, this is an additional regulatory instrument, because the other regulatory instrument which we have, which is the wholesale electricity market, is simply not enough to allow storage owners to benefit fully from the benefits that they create.
Thank you. There was a question which is, probably just technical clarification. How could you introduce a stochastic component to the model, such as the demand side, for example?
Well, this is a good question. In the model, all the players, they know demand, so they know that if demand is low, they have to store. I guess we should introduce some stochastic component around that demand level, and sometimes firms would store when demand doesn't turn out to be as low, and therefore this would create some slight inefficiencies, because storage doesn't necessarily take place when demand is the lowest because of these storage components. But I honestly think that when firms, be it storage owners or generators, when they participate in the wholesale electricity market, they have got a very good knowledge of demand. Forecast errors, as you know, demand forecast errors are quite small. So I don't think this is a first order effect.
Thank you. There was a question from somebody else, anonymous attendee, who's asking something to the effect, I'm going to paraphrase, what if you can't store enough? So, you have some installed capacity, some installed generation capacity, you have some demand, you have some installed storage capacity, and then for whatever reason, the interaction of supply and demand at some point in time just does not allow enough storage. Then what?
Absolutely, and this is what I wanted to convey when I said demand is not fully flattened, because if we had enough storage capacity to store enough, then this would mean that the marginal value of a storage investment would go down to zero, because I would store and immediately after I would start releasing. So the most common situation is a situation as the one described in the question. Most of the time, if not always, we won't have enough storage capacity, okay? So simply we just fill up our batteries and wait for demand to pick up to release it. So yes, storage capacity will be binding almost always.
Okay, of course, I didn't quite pick that up. There was a question also from David Prince, who is asking, what are the assumptions on the investment cost of storage versus the price difference of energy at different demand levels? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so our model is very stylized, so we just think of a storage capacity, the cost of investing in storage has been proportional to how much we store. Probably we could introduce some, now I think in the general model, now that you're mentioning this, we allow for economies of scale in storage capacity. So the shape of the storage investment cost is not that relevant for the results. We don't assume anything about the price differences. This is something that is endogenously determined. So I invest, or I optimally decide to invest so that the price difference that I get is equal, or the marginal price difference that I get is equal to this additional per unit cost of the investment. So the two things are jointly determining in equilibrium. I never invest so much so that the price differences, one of the previous questions really referred to this, right? Meaning that price differences over time get smaller and smaller. So if they really get smaller, I don't have incentives to invest more in storage. So there is this equilibrium condition relating price differences and the optimal storage capacity. That also depends on investment cost. Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. I think the other questions are essentially some kind of extension or repetition of what was asked and answered. So I'm not going to call upon them. I'd like to thank you very much again for addressing us early in the morning for you and for sharing what you've learned from your work. This is something that, as you know, we confront in Australia in a very practical sense, because there's a lot of battery deployments that is underway and is going to hit us in the future. So it's nice to have the tools to look a little bit into the future and know what to expect, at least from some angles. So thank you again, Natalia. Thanks to our audience as well to join us tonight. Hopefully we'll meet again next week. We have David Newbury next week. In the meantime, I'd like to, invite you to a virtual clap for Natalia. So thanks very much again. And we hope to host you very soon as well. Natalia, you were supposed to join us last year. I hope it's only being delayed.
I hope so too, and I'll be keeping a very close eye on the developments in storage in Australia. As far as I understand, you are making quite a lot of progress, so I would be more than happy to see this on the field.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, and thanks again to our audience for joining us today.
Thank you.